The rumors started the way most truths do in small towns, whispered quietly, carried by the wind, and ignored by everyone who didn't want trouble. But trouble has a way of finding the people who least deserve it. For months, a young widow named Claire had been bringing her late husband's old pickup to the same mechanic, trusting him with the only thing she had left of the man she loved. She believed every word he said, every bill he handed her, every warning about new problems he claimed needed fixing. What she didn't know was that each repair, each part, each lie was a thread in a web he'd been weaving around her, a web meant to drain her of every last dollar she had. Claire wasn't someone people noticed at first glance. She moved quietly, spoke softly, and carried a sadness that made even her smiles feel fragile. After her husband passed, she worked 2 jobs to stay afloat, never asking for help, never complaining. And maybe that's why no one questioned the mechanic's rising prices, or the way he always seemed to find one more thing wrong with the truck. But grief makes people vulnerable, and predators know where to hunt. It wasn't until one late afternoon, when she walked into the diner with tear-stained cheeks and a bill she could no longer pay, that fate finally intervened. At a table in the corner sat a group of bikers, rough around the edges, loud, and impossible to ignore. They weren't the type of men she would normally approach, yet something in her broke that day. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was hope. Maybe it was the feeling that if she didn't speak now, she'd lose the last piece of her husband forever. When she told them what had been happening, the diner fell silent. The men stared at the bill, then at Claire, then at each other. They'd seen scams before. They'd seen lies, greed, and the way bad men take advantage of good people. But seeing it done to a widow who had already lost everything, that hit different. It pulled at the part of them that still remembered what loyalty meant, what brotherhood demanded, what justice required. None of them said a word at first, but the decision was already made the moment they heard her voice crack. The mechanic thought he could take from her because no one would stand by her side. He was wrong. By sunrise, he would learn that some people might be quiet, but they are never truly alone. The bikers left the diner that evening with a silence heavier than any roar of their engines. It wasn't the kind of silence born from anger. It was the kind that came from witnessing injustice so raw it demanded action. Claire stood by the window as they pulled away, her hands trembling as she held the worn bill that had finally broken her. She had spent months believing she was the one failing, never imagining someone would deliberately prey on her grief. Now, for the first time, she watched people ride out not to judge her, but to stand for her. That alone brought tears to her eyes. Jack, the oldest of the group, led the way down the dark road toward the mechanic's shop. His jaw was tense, his thoughts running back over every detail Claire had shared. He knew her husband, a quiet man who once helped the bikers fix a flat on a winter night without asking for anything in return. Loyalty like that doesn't die. As the shop's neon sign flickered in the distance, Jack felt the weight of a debt long overdue. Not to Claire, but to the memory of the man who'd never let a stranger walk home alone. The shop was closed, but the light in the back office was still on. Through the dust-covered window, they could see the mechanic hunched over a small safe, counting stacks of money with a grin that made Jack's stomach turn. It wasn't just greed, it was pride, the pride of someone who thought he'd never be caught, never be questioned, never face consequences. The men exchanged glances, each of them feeling the same surge of disgust. They didn't need words. The decision was already made. They could have kicked down the door. They could have stormed in and let rage lead the way. But they weren't there for chaos. They were there for truth. Jack knocked once firmly. When the mechanic turned, he froze at the sight of them. His smirk faded, replaced by a flicker of fear. He tried to speak, but Jack held up the bill Claire had shown them. "Explain this," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of every injustice Claire had suffered. The mechanic stumbled over excuses, broken parts, necessary repairs, unexpected issues, but each lie fell apart under Jack's stare. With every stutter, every shift of his eyes, it became clearer that he had built an entire life on deception. And now, cornered by the very men he thought would never care, he realized his empire of lies was collapsing faster than he could rebuild it. The next morning, Claire walked into the diner expecting nothing more than another day of quiet survival. She didn't expect to see the bikers waiting for her, or the envelope Jack placed gently on the table. Her heart raced as she opened it. Inside were receipts, ledgers, and handwritten notes detailing every scam the mechanic had run. Not just on her, but on others too. People who trusted him. People he had drained dry. She looked up, tears gathering again, but this time they weren't from despair. They were from the shock of being believed. Jack told her about the confrontation, leaving out the parts he knew would frighten her. He didn't mention the threats, the shouting, or the way the mechanic nearly ran when he realized he'd been exposed. Instead, Jack focused on what mattered. They had proof now. Enough to shut the shop down, enough to get her money back, enough to make sure he never preyed on anyone again. Claire pressed a hand to her mouth, overwhelmed by the thought that strangers would go this far for her. But there was more. One of the younger bikers, Luke, had spent the entire night scanning through the papers, identifying every customer who had been cheated. He placed a second list in front of her. Names, phone numbers, amounts overcharged. "You're not alone," he said softly. "There are others, and they're going to know the truth." Claire felt a chill. For so long, she believed her struggle was hers alone. But now she saw how deep the injustice ran, and she realized that standing up wasn't just about reclaiming her money. It was about reclaiming her voice. Before she could respond, the diner door opened. A police officer stepped inside, his expression stern. Claire stiffened, old fear rising in her chest, until he nodded respectfully toward the bikers. "We received a complaint," he said, "and evidence." He held up the same envelope Jack had shown her. The mechanic was already in custody. Claire's legs nearly gave out. Months of manipulation, fear, and exhaustion suddenly came crashing down, replaced with a single overwhelming truth. It was finally over. Jack stayed beside her, steadying her as she tried to process everything. The diner buzzed with murmurs, customers whispering about what they'd heard. But Claire didn't hear any of it. For the first time since her husband's passing, she felt something she thought she had lost forever: safety. And behind that safety, something even deeper: the faint, trembling beginnings of hope. The hours that followed felt unreal to Claire. She sat at her usual booth, hands wrapped around a warm cup of tea, staring at the documents that had once represented her greatest burden. Now, they symbolized something entirely different. The moment she stopped being a victim and started becoming someone no one could take advantage of again. Outside the diner, the small town buzzed with the news of the mechanic's arrest. People who had once walked past Claire without noticing her now looked at her with a mix of sympathy, respect, and shame for not seeing sooner what had been happening. Jack watched all of it quietly. He wasn't a man who enjoyed attention or praise. He preferred to stay in the background, where loyalty wasn't something spoken but lived. He saw how Claire's shoulders straightened, how her breath steadied, how the deep ache in her eyes slowly lifted. He recognized that transformation. He'd seen it before in men who survived the road, who found purpose in the middle of chaos. But seeing it in her made something inside him settle. As if all of this, everything they had done, had been exactly what needed to happen. Later that afternoon, the other bikers returned with updates. Luke placed a stack of envelopes on the table. Letters from the townspeople who had been cheated too. Some were angry, some were devastated, and some simply wanted Claire to know they understood her pain now that their own had been uncovered. Claire opened one after another, tears filling her eyes until she could barely read. But these weren't tears of fear. They were tears of validation. For the first time, people saw her, really saw her, not as a widow to pity or a customer to deceive, but as a woman who had endured more than most people could bear. The group discussed the next steps: how to help the others get justice, how to pressure the authorities into conducting a full investigation, how to ensure the mechanic couldn't slip through the cracks of a broken system. Claire listened, absorbing every word. Her fear was still there, tucked beneath layers of exhaustion, but now it had a different shape. It wasn't a fear of being alone. It was the fear of finally stepping into a life where she was allowed to be strong. That night, after the diner closed, Claire walked the empty road home. Jack insisted on riding behind her, his motorcycle rumbling like a silent guardian. As she walked under the streetlights, she realized something she hadn't felt in a long time. She wasn't scared of the dark anymore. The world hadn't grown kinder overnight, but she had changed, and that made all the difference. The next morning, Claire woke with a sense of clarity she hadn't felt in years. She stood in front of the mirror, brushing her hair slowly, studying the woman staring back at her. She still looked tired, still bore the shadows of grief under her eyes. But something fundamental had shifted. She no longer saw someone fragile. She saw someone surviving, someone rebuilding, someone learning to rise again. And that was powerful enough to make her walk out the door with her head held a little higher. When she arrived at the diner, it was busier than usual. People approached her with kindness, offering support, telling her stories of their own losses or struggles. Claire didn't know what to say at first. She had spent so much time staying quiet, keeping her pain tucked away. But slowly, she began to speak. Not loudly, not dramatically, but honestly. Her voice, once barely heard, became steady. The town wasn't just supporting her, it was healing through her. The bikers arrived shortly after, settling into their usual booth. And for the first time, Claire didn't avoid them out of shyness. She walked over with confidence, thanking them personally, looking each one in the eye. These men, rough and feared by some, softened at her words. Respect, the kind that can't be demanded, only earned, filled the space between them. They had stepped into her life to right a wrong, but now, they found themselves woven into her story in ways they hadn't expected. Later that day, Jack suggested they visit the mechanic's shop together, not to confront the man, that had already been done, but to face the place where everything had started. Claire hesitated before agreeing. They rode there in a quiet procession, the rumble of engines echoing through the streets like a vow. When they arrived, Claire stepped inside the silent workshop, letting her fingers brush over the dusty counter where she had stood so many times. It didn't hurt like she expected. Instead, it felt like closing a chapter she and the world had kept open for too long. She left the shop feeling lighter, as if something invisible had finally loosened its grip on her heart. The bikers watched her with a quiet pride, knowing she had taken the hardest step of all, facing the ghost that had held her hostage. As they rode back into town together, Claire realized that healing didn't come all at once. It came in small moments, in difficult choices, in the unexpected kindness of strangers, and in the courage to believe that she deserved a better life than the one she had been forced to live. The following days unfolded in a way Claire never could have imagined. Instead of shrinking from the attention, she found herself stepping into it with a quiet grace that surprised even her. The police investigation moved quickly, faster than anyone expected, thanks to the mountain of evidence the bikers had uncovered. People who had once been silent victims came forward with stories of their own, each one adding weight to the case. Claire listened to them, comforted them, and realized she was no longer the only one who had been hurt. Her suffering had simply been the spark that revealed a fire burning beneath the whole town. Jack watched from the sidelines, his presence steady and unobtrusive. He wasn't the kind of man who needed to be thanked, but he could see the impact Claire's courage was having. She wasn't just healing. She was inspiring others to face their own pain. Every time she spoke up, every time she held someone's trembling hand, every time she refused to let shame silence her again, Jack felt something shift inside the group of bikers as well. They had always ridden with purpose, but now they rode with meaning. One afternoon, as Claire walked home from the diner, she paused at the small community board outside the market. Someone had pinned a letter there, handwritten, trembling, and signed, thanking her for being brave enough to confront the mechanic. "Your strength gave me mine," the letter read. Claire touched the paper gently, her chest tightening with emotion. She wasn't used to being seen this way. She wasn't used to being the reason someone else felt brave. But the truth settled over her like a warm light. She wasn't the broken widow anymore. She was someone who had endured, survived, and risen. That evening, the bikers invited her to join them at the edge of town, where the hills rolled out beneath the setting sun. They didn't talk much. They simply sat together on the grass, watching the sky shift from gold to fire to deep violet. Claire felt safe there, surrounded by the rumble of their quiet loyalty. As the wind brushed past her, she realized she could breathe for the first time in a long time. Not the shallow breaths of fear, but deep, steady breaths that tasted like freedom. When the sun finally slipped below the horizon, Jack turned to her and said, "You fought hard, Claire. You didn't run. That matters." She didn't answer at first, overwhelmed by the sincerity in his voice. Then, softly, she replied. "I didn't fight alone." And in that moment, a truth settled between them. A truth built not on romance, but on recognition. Two people, shaped by grief and resilience, had found strength in each other without ever needing to ask for it. Word spread quickly that the mechanic had agreed to a full confession. Faced with undeniable evidence and a town united against him, he had no choice. He admitted to every lie, every scam, every stolen dollar. The news hit the community like a storm, but this time, it was a cleansing one. People who had once felt powerless now stood taller, knowing they had been vindicated. Claire watched the town shift from disbelief to relief, each step a reminder that justice, even when delayed, still mattered. At the diner, something remarkable happened. Customers began offering Claire tips that weren't just money. They offered handmade meals, flowers from their gardens, invitations to gatherings she had always been too shy to attend. Children ran up to her with drawings, older women hugged her without warning, and men she barely knew tipped their hats respectfully as she passed. She had become a symbol not of pity, but of resilience, and the town embraced her not out of obligation, but out of genuine admiration. The bikers, for their part, remained a constant presence, not overwhelming, not protective in a smothering way, but present in the way true guardians are. They helped repair the town's trust, offering free motorcycle repairs for those who'd been scammed, teaching younger residents basic maintenance skills so they would never be taken advantage of again. What began as justice for one woman had become a movement of empowerment for everyone. One late afternoon, as Claire closed the diner, she noticed a small box on the counter with her name written in careful handwriting. Inside was a key, old, brass, heavy, and a note from the previous owner of an abandoned workshop whose husband had once been deceived by the same mechanic. "I want you to have this," the note read. "Use it for something good." Claire held the key tightly, feeling its weight not just in her hand, but in her heart. It was more than a gift. It was a second chance at building something of her own. She stepped outside into the fading sunlight, the key glinting between her fingers, and saw Jack leaning against his motorcycle, arms crossed, waiting. He raised an eyebrow at her smile, and she lifted the key as if it were a treasure. "Looks like I have a future to build," she said. Jack returned her smile, small, quiet, proud. "Then let's start building," he answered, as the engines roared softly behind him. Claire visited the old workshop the next morning, her footsteps echoing softly as she stepped inside. Dust floated lazily through the slivers of sunlight that slipped in through cracked windows, illuminating tools left untouched for years. The air smelled of rust and time, but beneath it, she sensed possibility. The place felt worn, tired, but not hopeless. In a way, it reminded her of herself. She ran her fingers along an old workbench, imagining what it could become. A space where people weren't deceived, where honesty lived in every repair, where trust wasn't something fragile, but something earned. The bikers arrived moments later, their engines rumbling like a chorus announcing a new chapter. Jack stepped inside first, surveying the room with the eyes of someone who had rebuilt more than engines in his lifetime. "It has good bones," he said simply. Claire smiled at how easily he saw potential, even in ruins. Together, they walked the length of the workshop, discussing its future, a fair mechanic shop, a place that served the community instead of exploiting it, a place built on the values she had reclaimed through her struggle. Luke found an old sign buried beneath a tarp in the back room. It was faded, the paint chipped, but the name still visible. "Reed's Auto Repair." Claire stared at it quietly. Reed, her late husband's last name. The realization washed over her like a soft wave. This building, this workbench, this abandoned place, it had belonged to the same man who once fixed broken engines in exchange for nothing but gratitude. A man who believed in honesty, in kindness, in fairness. A man whose legacy she had thought she lost forever. Now, it stood in front of her, waiting to be revived. The bikers didn't ask permission. They simply began working. Dust flew as they cleared debris, repaired walls, replaced broken panels. Their movements were rhythmic, almost reverent. It wasn't just labor, it was loyalty. They were restoring more than a workshop. They were restoring a memory, a piece of Claire's heart she thought was buried with her husband. She watched them, overwhelmed, realizing that sometimes family isn't defined by blood, but by the people who show up when it matters most. As the day ended, Claire stood at the entrance, looking at the workshop bathed in the golden glow of sunset. It was still old, still worn, still in need of care, but it was alive again. And so was she. For the first time in years, she felt a future taking shape, not as a faint hope, but as something tangible, something real. The road ahead wasn't easy, but she wasn't walking it alone. The renovation became a project the entire town rallied around. Word spread quickly. A new mechanic shop was opening, one built on honesty, run by a widow who had endured more than most, and still found the strength to rise. Volunteers arrived daily. Farmers offering scrap materials, teenagers wanting to help paint, retired mechanics eager to teach Claire everything they knew. The once abandoned building transformed into a symbol of resilience, each repaired wall a testament to the courage that had sparked the change. Claire was determined to learn the trade herself. She spent long hours studying manuals, practicing under the guidance of the older bikers, and listening to the stories of mechanics who had once worked with her husband. At first, she felt clumsy, ashamed even, worried she wouldn't live up to the expectations placed upon her. But every time doubt crept in, Jack would remind her of something simple. Skill comes with time. Intent comes from the heart. You already have a second. Little by little, she grew confident. She learned how to replace filters, check belts, diagnose engine issues. Her hands got dirty, her clothes stained, but she wore it like armor. Each new skill was a victory, not against the mechanic who stole from her, but for herself, for the life she was rebuilding piece by piece, bolt by bolt. One afternoon, a woman walked into the workshop holding a crumpled receipt, one Claire recognized immediately. The same handwriting, the same inflated prices, the same lies she had suffered. The woman's voice shook as she explained her situation, unsure if she'd be believed. Claire listened, heart aching not from her own past, but from the knowledge that someone else had carried the same fear. She sat the woman down, looked her in the eyes, and said softly, "You're safe here." Those words meant something now. They weren't a gesture. They were a promise. That evening, as the sun dipped low, Claire locked the workshop doors with a profound sense of pride. She wasn't just opening a business. She was opening a refuge, a place where no one would be lied to, where no widow would be cheated, where no one would walk away feeling small. And as she watched the bikers laugh and lean against their motorcycles, she knew something with absolute certainty. This wasn't just her fight anymore. This was their mission, a mission built on healing, justice, and the kind of loyalty that can turn strangers into family. As the workshop neared completion, something remarkable began happening in the town. People who had once kept to themselves started opening up, sharing stories they had buried for years. It was as if Claire's courage had given them permission to confront their own wounds. Some came forward with tales of being cheated by different businesses. Others spoke about personal losses, betrayals, and struggles they had felt too ashamed to voice. Claire listened to each one, never rushing, never judging. In her presence, pain didn't feel like weakness. It felt like truth finally finding its way to the surface. The bikers noticed the shift as well. Where they were once seen as intimidating outsiders, now they were greeted with nods, handshakes, and warm smiles. Their presence, once met with suspicion, had become a symbol of protection. Children waved to them from porches, elderly neighbors brought them homemade meals, and business owners asked for their help organizing charity events. What had begun as a single act of justice had bloomed into a quiet revolution of unity. The town was healing, and so were they. Claire herself grew stronger with each passing day. She had found a rhythm in her new life, balancing the workshop training with managing paperwork, speaking with customers, and planning the grand reopening. She often caught herself smiling at odd moments, while tightening a bolt, sweeping the floor, or painting the new sign bearing her husband's name. She realized that healing didn't always arrive with fireworks. Sometimes it came softly, in steady breaths, in the warmth of sunlight through a dusty window, in the hum of engines rebuilt by honest hands. One evening, as she worked late alone, she came across a box hidden at the back of the workshop. Inside were old photographs of her husband with former customers, smiling, laughing, shaking hands over freshly repaired vehicles. There were handwritten notes, too. Thank you letters, blessings, messages of gratitude. She pressed the papers to her chest, tears filling her eyes not with sorrow, but with deep, aching love. She whispered into the quiet room, I'm still carrying you. I'm still honoring you. And for the first time, the memories didn't hurt. They healed. When she stepped outside, she found Jack waiting, leaning against his motorcycle the same way he had the day they first spoke. She held up one of the photographs, showing him her husband's proud smile. Jack studied it, then nodded slowly. He'd be damn proud of you, he said. Claire felt something warm settle in her chest. Not romance, not longing, but gratitude. Gratitude for someone who saw her not as fragile, not as broken, but as someone capable of building something extraordinary from the ruins of her past. The day of the reopening arrived with the kind of quiet excitement usually reserved for holidays. People gathered outside the workshop long before the doors opened, their breaths visible in the cool morning air. Claire stood inside, hands trembling slightly as she looked around at the place she had rebuilt. A workshop reborn from dust and grief into something bright, honest, and full of purpose. The bikers flanked the entrance, their leather jackets gleaming under the rising sun, standing not as guards, but as brothers. When Claire finally unlocked the door, the crowd applauded. A wave of emotion washed over her so powerfully she had to pause, breathe, and steady herself. The first customer was an elderly man with a kind smile and a worn-out truck that needed more love than repairs. Claire shook his hand with confidence, promising him fair prices and honest work. As she inspected the engine, she heard laughter outside. Real, light, hopeful laughter. It was the sound of a town beginning again. Throughout the day, customers came and went, each one leaving with more than fixed vehicles. They left with trust, something far more valuable. Claire worked alongside the bikers, learning, teaching, laughing, and rebuilding in ways she never imagined. And every time she wiped grease from her hands, she felt the echoes of her husband's legacy in every movement. Reed's auto repair was alive again, but this time it carried her strength, her vision, her heart. Near sunset, the workshop finally quieted. Claire stepped outside, the sky burning gold and orange as the sun dipped toward the horizon. Jack approached, handing her a cold soda, and together they watched the fading light paint the road. It felt symbolic, the closing of a chapter, the opening of another. You did it, Jack said. Claire shook her head gently. We did it. He didn't argue. He just smiled because he knew she was right. Healing, like rebuilding, had never been a solitary act. As the engines of the bikers roared softly in the background, Claire looked at the workshop, at the town, at the life she had rebuilt from ashes. And she realized something profound. Justice hadn't just been served. Hope had been restored. Strength had been reclaimed. And a widow who once walked with trembling steps now stood firmly on ground she had carved with her own two hands. In the end, Claire's story became far more than a tale of injustice corrected. It became a reminder that even the smallest voices can echo louder than anyone expects when truth finally rises to the surface. She began as a widow weighed down by loss, fear, and manipulation, but through courage and community, she transformed into a symbol of quiet strength. The workshop she rebuilt wasn't just a business. It was a testament to resilience, to healing, and to the power of standing up when the world seems determined to keep you kneeling. Through her journey, we see that broken things can be mended, and broken people can be remade, not in spite of hardship, but because of it. And the bikers who stood by her showed that loyalty doesn't depend on blood or background. It depends on heart. They stepped into her story not as saviors, but as witnesses who refused to turn away from unfairness. In defending her, they rediscovered their own capacity for purpose, connection, and redemption. Their rumbling engines, once symbols of rebellion, became symbols of protection and solidarity. Together, they proved that sometimes the roughest people carry the gentlest intentions, and that kindness, when paired with courage, can shake the foundations of an entire town. As the community rallied around Claire, every repaired wall of the workshop seemed to rebuild a piece of the town itself. The lies that once thrived in shadows collapsed under the weight of truth and unity. What began as one woman's struggle became the collective rising of an entire neighborhood, showing that healing isn't a solitary journey. It's one shared through compassion, empathy, and the courage to listen. Claire's workshop became more than a place for mending engines. It became a safe haven where dignity was restored and honesty flourished. Perhaps the greatest lesson her story leaves behind is this: strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it trembles. Sometimes it looks like a widow tightening a bolt with unsteady hands, choosing to rebuild a life the world thought had already fallen apart. But strength is strength, whether loud or quiet. And when it finally rises, it inspires others to rise with it. Claire didn't just reclaim what was stolen from her. She reclaimed herself. And in doing so, she lit a path for others still waiting for the courage to begin again. If this story touched you, if it made you reflect on the people we overlook or the battles we fight in silence, let your voice be part of the conversation. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts, like the video to help this message reach others, and subscribe to the channel for more stories that remind us of the strength hidden within ordinary lives. Your engagement not only supports this work, it helps carry these messages further, inspiring others in ways you may never fully see.